What if the Gospels you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are not the oldest stories about Jesus' life, but merely the ones that survived a vote? Think carefully about what that question actually means. Somewhere between 100 and 400 AD, dozens of texts about Jesus were circulating across the ancient world. Communities read them aloud by lamplight, gathered in homes and borrowed rooms, listening to words they believed were sacred. Scribes copied them by hand onto papyrus and vellum, letter by careful letter, sometimes laboring for weeks over a single manuscript. People wept over these texts, memorized them, built their entire understanding of who Jesus was, what he had been like as a person, as a child, as a man. Around them then, one by one, most of those texts were declared too strange, too dangerous, or simply too difficult to fit inside the emerging theology of a church that was slowly, deliberately becoming an institution. Some were burned. Some were sealed away in places where they would not be found for centuries. Most simply stopped being copied, and when the last surviving copy wore out or was lost or destroyed, the text was gone, forever in most cases. But a handful survived, in monastery cellars, in sealed desert jars, in the memories of communities scattered across the ancient world who could not forget what they had read, no matter what any official authority said about it. This is the story of one of those survivors. The text is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Before we go any further, we need to clear up a confusion that trips almost everyone who first encounters this document, because there are two different ancient texts that share the name Gospel of Thomas, and they are completely different books with almost nothing in common. The more famous one, the one discovered sealed inside a clay jar near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, is a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. No narrative, no story, no characters, no scenes, no dramatic consequences, just a list of cryptic and often beautiful teachings. That text has attracted enormous scholarly attention, and it deserves it. But that is not what we are here to discuss. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is something else entirely. It is a narrative, a story with characters and scenes and dialogue and consequences that matter. It covers the years of Jesus' life that the canonical Gospels skip over almost completely. The long span from early boyhood through around age 12. Matthew and Luke give us the birth story, the manger, the Magi, the flight into Egypt. Luke gives us a single scene at the Jerusalem temple when Jesus is 12 years old, astonishing the scholars who question him. And then there is nothing. A gap of roughly 18 years between that temple scene and the moment Jesus appears again at the Jordan River to be baptized by John. 18 silent years, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas fills that silence. And what it puts there is deeply unsettlingly strange. The earliest manuscripts we have are in Greek, dating to approximately the 2nd century AD. Scholars generally believe that oral versions of these stories circulated even before that. That people were telling these tales about the child, Jesus, before anyone thought to write them down in a form that could be copied and carried. Once the text existed in writing, it spread. It was read in Syria, in Egypt, in the communities scattered across Asia Minor and North Africa that made up the fragmented, fiercely diverse world of early Christianity. Communities that we would barely recognize by modern standards. Communities with their own texts, their own teachers, their own furious internal debates about the nature of Jesus and what had actually happened in Palestine, read this gospel and found it true. Not true the way a legal document is true, true the way a dream is true, recognizable at some level below doctrine, charged with something that formal religion had not yet found words for. It was never condemned in a single dramatic moment. There was no council that gathered specifically to debate the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and vote to destroy it. The process was quieter than that, and in some ways more effective. When church authorities began the long work of deciding which texts were authoritative, which writings could be trusted to reflect genuine apostolic tradition, and which were too local, too strange, or too theologically inconvenient, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas simply did not make the list. It was excluded by omission. It died not by fire, but by silence, and silence, stretched across enough centuries, becomes a kind of burial. Now here is the thing that should stop you completely. One story from this buried gospel, a single scene, a single miracle, reappears more than 5 centuries after the infancy gospel of Thomas was written. It reappears not in a Christian text, not in a newly discovered manuscript, not in a later church document. It reappears in the Quran, in the Holy Scripture of Islam, in a religion that did not exist when the infancy gospel of Thomas was composed. The same miracle, the same setting, the same impossible act, reproduced inside one of the most widely read and carefully preserved texts in all of human history. The miracle is this. Jesus, at 5 years old, shapes birds out of wet clay on a Sabbath morning. A Jewish elder sees what the child has made and accuses him of violating the holy day. And then Jesus breathes life into the clay. The birds move. They lift from his hands. They fly away and are gone. That scene is in a 2nd century apocryphal childhood gospel that the church quietly set aside. And it is also in the Quran. The question of how it traveled from one to the other is not a minor footnote in the history of comparative religion. It is a window into something much larger. The way sacred stories move through the world entirely outside the control of any institution, carried through trade routes and missionary journeys and oral traditions and translated manuscripts, through the memories of grandmothers and the sermons of wandering monks and the arguments of merchants at desert way stations. It is a story about how religion actually lives and breathes and migrates when no official body is managing it. This video is going to follow that story from its origin to its destination. We will read the original miracle in full and meet the child at the center of it. A child who, in the pages of this forbidden gospel, is genuinely frightening. We will understand why the early church could not bring itself to canonize this text, and what that choice reveals about how doctrinal systems are constructed and defended. We will trace the underground route the story traveled, through Syriac Christianity, through the Arabic-speaking Christian communities of the Arabian Peninsula, through centuries of oral transmission that kept it alive long after official religion had turned its back. We will arrive in 7th century Arabia and watch the same miracle surface in the Quran, reinterpreted, repurposed, made to carry a completely different theological weight. And finally, we will sit with both versions together and ask what it means that 2 religions, separated by 6 centuries and a profound metaphysical disagreement about who Jesus was, reached for the exact same image when they needed to say something true. But we begin where the story begins. A 5-year-old boy, a Sabbath morning, a stream running along the edge of a Jewish village. He is crouched at the water's edge, his small hands pressed into the wet clay of the bank, shaping something between his palms. He is not praying, he is not at study, he is making something, and the thing he is making is going to live. The adults standing nearby do not yet understand what they are watching. They will not know whether to worship him or run. By the time this story ends, they still will not know. That uncertainty is exactly where we need to begin. It is the Sabbath. A Jewish village, sometime in the 1st century, somewhere in Galilee. A stream runs along the edge of town, shallow and cold. At its bank is a boy, 5 years old. He is doing something with his hands in the clay at the water's edge. Deliberate, absorbed, the way children work when they have forgotten there are adults in the world. He is playing. What comes next is not play. This is the scene the infancy gospel of Thomas places before us at the opening of its 2nd chapter. Before we rush to the miracle, we need to sit inside this passage the way its first readers would have, slowly, because every detail the author chose is doing work. The text reads, in modern translation, "When this boy Jesus was 5 years old, he was playing at the ford of a brook, and he gathered together the waters that flowed there into pools, and made them straightway clean, and commanded them by his word alone. He made soft clay, and fashioned thereof 12 sparrows, and it was the Sabbath when he did these things. And there were also many other little children playing with him." Start with the age. 5 years old. Whatever power is about to manifest, has no protective scaffolding of maturity around it. A 5-year-old's understanding of consequences is what governs this moment, and nothing else. Now look at what Jesus does before he makes anything. He gathers the flowing water into pools. Then he cleans it, commands the water, and it obeys. This is almost a throwaway miracle, tucked into the setup so quickly it barely registers. But it is there deliberately. The author wants us to understand that the clay birds are not a fluke. Even the water listens to this child. Then he makes the sparrows, 12 of them, shaped from the purified clay with his hands. 12 is not explained, whether it carries symbolic weight pointing toward the tribes, or the apostles, or simply gives the scene a formal, ritualized quality. The number sits in the text like a quiet signal. And it is the Sabbath. The author states this plainly, almost as a stage direction. But for any reader in a Jewish or Jewish Christian community, that single sentence transforms everything. Creating objects on the Sabbath is labor. Labor on the Sabbath is sin. This child is committing a religious offense in broad daylight, with other children watching, witnesses who will go home and tell their parents. A man named Annas sees the boy in different manuscripts. He is a scribe, an elder, a community figure with religious standing and the authority to act on what he observes. His reaction is not wonder. It is instant outrage. He does not go to Jesus. He goes to Joseph and delivers the accusation directly. Your child is at the brook, and he has taken clay and fashioned 12 sparrows, and has profaned the Sabbath. The word profaned is not mild. Profaning the Sabbath is a serious charge. In the Torah, Sabbath violation carried the sentence of death. Annas is not tattling about a minor infraction. He is bringing a genuine legal complaint against Joseph's household. And yet his accusation contains a strange gap. He describes the birds accurately. He does not know what Jesus is about to do with them. Joseph comes to the stream. The text says he made a sign at the boy. A gesture of reproach, the silent correction a father gives a child in a public situation. He does not strike Jesus. He does not shout. He is embarrassed and trying to manage a scene he doesn't fully understand. Jesus sees the sign. He sees his father's face. And then, in what the text describes, with remarkable economy, he clapped his hands together and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, "Go." The clay is gone. 12 sparrows lift into the Sabbath air and fly away. The text notes they departed with a noise. There is sound to this miracle, the rush of wings and then sky. The evidence has vanished. The accusation cannot be proven. The witnesses are left at the brook with a sight they will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. Now we need to go backward, because if you only know the clay birds, you have missed the half of this story that explains everything. Earlier in the same chapter, before the birds, before the purified water, another child runs through the pools Jesus has gathered. He scatters them, possibly by accident. Jesus turns on the boy, he curses him. The child withers, he dies. The text does not soften this. It is not metaphor. A child is dead because Jesus directed his anger at him in a moment of 5-year-old fury. The village erupts. Parents come to Joseph, frightened, demanding to know what kind of child they are living beside. Joseph, humiliated at a complete loss, takes Jesus by the ear and scolds him. The ear. He takes the divine child by the ear. The clay bird's miracle must be read inside that context. It is not a charming anecdote about a gifted child's first miracle. It happens in the immediate aftermath of a killing. The same hands that cursed a child to death have just shaped 12 birds from clay and breathed life into them. The power moving through this boy is not benevolent by nature. It has no stable moral direction. It moves wherever a 5-year-old's emotional state points it. Toward anger, toward play, toward death, toward life, and no adult in this village has any way to predict or prevent what comes next. This is what the infancy gospel of Thomas is doing that the canonical gospels never attempt. It is taking seriously what it would actually look like if the divine entered the world in the form of a genuine child, not a peaceful infant in a manger, not a precocious 12-year-old impressing scholars in the temple. A real child with real emotional volatility in possession of real divine power. The answer the text arrives at is unambiguous. It would be terrifying. It would be miraculous and monstrous in the same breath. It would be completely ungovernable. The Jesus of the canonical Gospels arrives at 30, measured, formed, every word and act shaped by clear theological purpose. The Jesus of the infancy Gospel of Thomas is 5, and he is none of those things. He is dangerous in the way that fully realized power in an unformed person is always dangerous. He's exactly the figure a religious institution building a coherent doctrine of salvation cannot afford to have at the center of its sacred texts. And yet there he stands, at the brook, his hands empty, the bird's already gone. He is 5 years old. He just answered an accusation with a miracle, and he will not apologize. The adults do not know what to do with him. The church eventually decided it did not know either. But the story refused to disappear, and in the next chapter we will start to understand why the institution said no and what that refusal cost. Here is the question this chapter exists to answer. If the infancy Gospel of Thomas was so widely read, so emotionally powerful, and describes miracles that are genuine and astonishing, why did it not make the canon? The easy answer is that powerful institutions suppress inconvenient texts. That answer is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. The fuller answer involves a theological problem the Church could not solve, and understanding that problem requires understanding how the canon actually got made. Most people who know anything about this subject arrive with one image in their heads: a council. Bishops seated in a great hall, voting on which books belong in the Bible. Usually they're thinking of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which has accumulated enormous mythological weight in popular culture as the moment the Bible was assembled by committee. This is largely wrong. Nicaea dealt primarily with the Arian controversy, the question of whether Christ was fully divine or a created being subordinate to God. The canon was not settled there. It was not settled at any single moment, in any single hall, by any single vote. Canon formation was a long, decentralized, and genuinely messy process that unfolded over several centuries, driven by accumulating consensus rather than any top-down decree. Different Christian communities used different texts for a very long time. Texts that some communities treated as scripture, others regarded as peripheral or useful but not authoritative. What gradually stabilized into the New Testament we know today was shaped by roughly 3 criteria that church leaders applied informally and inconsistently over many generations. Apostolic origin. Was the text written by an apostle or by someone in direct contact with one? Orthodoxy. Did the text support the doctrinal positions emerging from the major councils and episcopal debates? And widespread use. Was this text being read by multiple communities across significant geographical distance? The infancy Gospel of Thomas had problems with all 3 of these tests. But the problems went deeper than a checklist. The first and most fundamental problem was the cursing child. The episode we examined in the previous chapter, the child who runs through Jesus's water pools and is cursed to death by a 5-year-old Jesus, is not a peripheral detail that editors could quietly remove. It is structurally embedded in the same chapter as the clay bird's miracle. You cannot keep the birds and discard the corpse. They are the same story, and a Jesus who kills a child in anger is a Jesus who has sinned. In the theological framework the early church was constructing with increasing care and precision, the sinlessness of Christ was not a minor attribute. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire salvation architecture. The argument for why Christ's death atones for human sin rests on the premise that he was himself without sin, a perfect sacrifice, an unblemished offering. A 5-year-old who murders a neighbor child in a fit of temper is not an unblemished anything. He is a child who needs atonement himself. The church could not build its soteriology on that foundation. The second problem was what theologians call kenosis. The Greek word means emptying, and it refers to the doctrine that in becoming human, Christ voluntarily set aside, emptied himself of, the prerogatives of divine power, choosing to inhabit fully the limitations of human experience while remaining, in some mysterious sense, also fully God. It is a delicate theological balance, and the IGT destroys it entirely. The Jesus of this gospel has not emptied himself of anything. He redirects water by speaking to it. He shapes clay and it becomes life. He curses and people die. He is operating at full divine capacity, without restraint, without apparent guidance from the Father, without any evident submission to human limitation. This is not kenosis. This is a God wearing a child's face, while retaining every weapon in the divine arsenal. The early church could not square that picture with the theology it was building. The third problem was Joseph. In the canonical tradition, Joseph is a dignified figure, quiet, obedient to divine instruction, a righteous man who protects his family and fulfills his role with silent integrity. He is passive, but he is not powerless. He is a man God trusts to raise his son. In the infancy gospel of Thomas, Joseph is terrified of his own child and completely helpless before him. He makes a gesture at Jesus, as though he is trying to wave off a stray animal. When the village comes to him with complaints, "Your child killed a boy, your child blinded a teacher who tried to correct him," he can offer nothing. He cannot control what is happening in his own household. He grabs the divine child by the ear at one point, and the image is almost comic in its inadequacy. The authority of the Father, which was central to Jewish family structure, and which the Incarnation was supposed to honor by placing the Son of God inside a human family. That authority is a fiction in this text. Joseph is a bystander in his own home. The fourth problem was the audience. The IGT circulated with particular enthusiasm in communities that the consolidating Orthodox Church viewed with suspicion. Syriac Christians with their own competing Christological traditions, Gnostic-adjacent communities that read freely and without the guidance of episcopal authority, groups that were less interested in doctrinal coherence than in the felt reality of divine encounter. The text's popularity in those circles was not a mark in its favor. A document beloved by the heterodox was, by the logic of canon formation, a document that required extra scrutiny. The IGT did not pass that scrutiny, and so it was set aside, not burned, not formally condemned, not placed alongside the Gospel of Judas on any explicit list of forbidden texts. It was simply not chosen. No council voted it out. No bishop issued an edict against it. It was excluded by omission, which is the quietest and most effective kind of exclusion there is. It stopped being copied by the institutions that controlled the production of manuscripts. And texts that stop being copied, in a world before printing, eventually cease to exist, except in the places where official copying was never the point. The IGT survived in those places. Manuscript copies persisted in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, Ethiopia, Georgia, Ireland, a scattered constellation of communities where official Roman or Byzantine ecclesiastical control was distant, incomplete, or simply irrelevant to daily religious life. The text was read in at least 6 languages. It shaped popular piety in ways that never appeared in official records, because popular piety rarely does. People who had never heard of any council's decision still knew the story of the clay birds. It lived in the gap between what religion officially teaches and what human beings actually carry in their hearts. Here is the paradox that will drive everything that follows. The more carefully the institutional church tried to manage the boundaries of sacred text, the more certain stories slipped through those boundaries and traveled beyond them. The infancy Gospel of Thomas, excluded from the canon somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd century, went on to cross a desert it had never been aimed at, enter a tradition it had never anticipated, and be quoted in a scripture that would not exist for 5 more centuries. By the time of Muhammad, the claybird story had traveled further than any church council could have imagined. It was no longer Christian property. It was no longer anyone's property. It was simply a story the world had decided to keep. Picture a map of the ancient world, not the political map, not the one with the borders of empires and the names of kings, a different kind of map. This one traces the movement of stories, sacred stories, apocryphal stories, the stories that official religion had declined to endorse, but that people could not stop repeating to each other across the Mediterranean, across the Fertile Crescent, down into the Arabian Peninsula, from 200 AD to 600 AD. No army moved them, no institution carried them. They moved the way rumors move, the way songs move. In mouths, in memory, in the human compulsion to pass on something that felt true. In the ancient world, the vast majority of religious knowledge traveled by voice. Literacy rates were low, manuscripts were expensive, and the codex, the bound book, was a luxury available mainly to institutions and the wealthy. Ordinary believers did not own scripture, they heard it. A monk in Syria tells a pilgrim the story of the clay birds on the road to a holy site. The pilgrim carries it to Alexandria. A merchant in Alexandria repeats it, slightly altered, to a Jewish trader bound south for Yemen. The trader's family has already heard a version. Their Christian neighbor told it differently, with different details, a different number of birds, a different emphasis on what the miracle meant. None of these people is a passive recipient. They are active participants in a living tradition. They reshape what they receive to fit the world they know, the theology they hold, the language they speak, and then they pass it on. This is how the infancy gospel of Thomas survived the church's silence. Not through institutional copying, but through human memory. Not through sanctioned transmission, but through the irrepressible tendency of a good story to find whoever needs to hear it. The single most important conduit for that transmission. The one that matters most for understanding how the clay birds crossed from early Christianity into the Arabian world was Syriac Christianity. Syriac was the liturgical language of Christianity in the regions of modern Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Syriac-speaking Christians were not a minor sect. They were one of the most geographically expansive expressions of the faith in the ancient world, reaching through missionary effort into India, Central Asia, and across the Arabian trade routes, centuries before Western Christianity made any sustained contact with those regions. They read the infancy gospel of Thomas. They translated it into Syriac. They preached from it in communities that had never heard of the Council of Nicaea and would not have been especially interested in its rulings if they had. Syriac Christianity operated largely outside the orbit of Roman and Byzantine ecclesiastical authority, following its own traditions, its own theological controversies, its own sense of which texts carried weight. The Syriac Church of the East maintained active trade and missionary networks throughout the Arabian Peninsula. This is documented history, not speculation. Christian communities of meaningful size existed in Najran, a city in what is now southwestern Saudi Arabia that was home to a significant Christian population, prosperous enough that their persecution by a local ruler in the 6th century became a cause of regional outrage and military intervention. Christians lived in Yemen. They lived along the trade routes connecting the Persian Gulf Coast to the Hijaz, the Western Arabian region that would become the heartland of early Islam. This was the road the clay bird story traveled. Not in a single journey, but in the slow accumulation of tellings and retellings across communities, already embedded in the landscape Muhammad would later inhabit. And then there is the Arabic infancy gospel, a text that almost no one outside of academic circles has encountered, but which is one of the most important documents in this entire story. The Arabic infancy gospel is a compilation of childhood miracle narratives about Jesus, probably assembled in its current form in the 6th century, though the individual stories it contains are substantially older. It was written in Arabic. It was written for Arabic-speaking Christian communities. It contains the clay bird's miracle. Let that sit for a moment, a text in the Arabic language, circulating among Arabic-speaking Christian communities in the Arabian Peninsula, telling the story of the child Jesus breathing life into birds made of clay. And this text predates the Quran. This is not conjecture built on inference. The Arabic infancy gospel exists. Its manuscript tradition has been studied and dated. It is physical proof that the clay bird story was in Arabic language, religious circulation in the very region, and the very era that immediately preceded the Quran's revelation. The story did not need to be imported. It was already there. Understanding the religious landscape of the Arabian Peninsula in Muhammad's lifetime is essential here, because the popular image of pre-Islamic Arabia as uniformly pagan is substantially wrong. The peninsula was religiously plural in ways that most Western readers never encounter in their education. Substantial Jewish communities had been established for centuries in Medina, then called Yathrib, and in Khaybar and other settlements in the Hijaz. These were not recent arrivals. They were long-rooted communities with developed religious and literary cultures. Christian communities occupied Najran and maintained presence along the major trade arteries running north and south. The Quran itself reflects this reality with remarkable directness. It addresses the people of the book, Jews and Christians, as real, present, theologically engaged interlocutors, not distant abstractions. These are people Muhammad's community was actually arguing with, trading with, living beside. Muhammad's own biography records contact with Christian religious figures. The famous encounter with the monk Bahira, who reportedly recognized signs of prophethood in the young Muhammad during a trading journey to Syria, is one such account. His first wife Khadijah had a Christian cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, who was learned in scripture and who, according to traditional Islamic sources, identified Muhammad's first revelation as consistent with the prophetic tradition he knew from Christian texts. The oral religious culture Muhammad moved through was not monolithic. It was dense with Jewish midrash, Christian apocrypha, oral theological debate, and the remembered stories of a dozen competing traditions. The clay bird story was woven into that fabric before the first verse of the Quran was revealed. This is the reframe that changes the question entirely. Most people, when they first learn that the clay bird's miracle appears in both the infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Quran, instinctively ask, how did the story get from one to the other? The phrasing assumes a journey, a deliberate transfer across a gap, but there was no gap. By 610 AD, when Muhammad received his first revelation, the clay bird story had been circulating in Arabic among the communities surrounding him for at least a century. It had not arrived from outside. It was already furniture. It was the kind of story that needed no introduction, because it had already been introduced, already absorbed, already folded into the lived religious imagination of the region. The story did not cross a border. It seeped through one. It moved in the prayers of Syriac missionaries, in the manuscripts of Arabic-speaking Christian communities, in the arguments of travelers at way stations along the incense road, in the memories of mothers in Najran, putting children to sleep with stories about the boy who made birds from clay. By the time the Quran spoke the words, by the permission of God, and placed those birds in the hands of the Prophet Isa, the audience that first heard those words already knew the story. They had known it for generations. The Quran was not importing a foreign miracle. It was lifting something from the shared inheritance of the world it had grown from, and remaking it into something entirely new. Here is the passage. Read it before we do anything else with it. Surah 349, from the chapter called Ali Imran, the family of Imran, and make him a messenger to the children of Israel, who will say, Indeed, I have come to you with a sign from your Lord, in that I design for you from clay, that which is like the form of a bird. Then I breathe into it, and it becomes a bird by permission of Allah. And I cure the blind and the leper, and I give life to the dead, by permission of Allah. And I inform you of what you eat and what you store in your houses. Indeed, in that is a sign for you if you are believers. And then the second passage, Surah 5:110 from Al-Ma'idah, the table spread. Here it is God who speaks, succeeding Jesus directly at the end of time, recalling what was given to him. O Jesus, Son of Mary, remember my favor upon you and upon your mother when I supported you with the pure spirit, and you spoke to the people in the cradle and in maturity. And remember when I taught you writing and wisdom and the Torah and the gospel, and when you designed from clay what was like the form of a bird with my permission. Then you breathed into it, and it became a bird with my permission. The same birds, the same clay, the same breath. 5 centuries and an entirely different religion later, and the birds are still there. To understand what the Quran is doing with this story, we first need to understand who the Quran's Jesus actually is, because most people on both sides of the Christian-Muslim divide have a distorted picture of the answer. The Quran's Jesus, called Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus son of Mary, is one of the most significant figures in Islamic theology. He is mentioned across 15 surahs. He holds the title Al-Masih, the Messiah, which the Quran uses without fully unpacking its meaning in the way Christian theology does, but uses it deliberately and with weight. He is born of a virgin. The Quran contains a full nativity narrative in Surah 19 that is in several ways more detailed than the canonical gospel accounts. He performs genuine miracles, healing the blind, curing lepers, raising the dead. He will return at the end of time. In many respects, the Quranic Isa is closer to the Jesus of the Gospels than most Christians ever learn, because the comparison is rarely made in settings where both sides are actually listening. And yet there is one point of divergence so vast that it reorders everything else. The Quran explicitly states, in Surah 4:157, that Jesus was not crucified, or rather, it states that it appeared to those who killed him as though he was. But God raised him up before the death occurred. This single doctrinal move carries enormous consequences. If Jesus was not crucified, there is no resurrection from the dead, no atoning sacrifice, no salvation purchased through suffering, no theological mechanism by which his death wipes out human sin. In the Quran, Jesus does not save anyone. He is a sign. He is a messenger carrying divine revelation to the children of Israel. He performs miracles not to redeem humanity, but to demonstrate the authority behind his message, to prove that the words he speaks come from God. And this is precisely where the clay birds become indispensable. In the Quran's portrait of Isa, miracles are credentials. They are evidence. They say, this man was sent. His words carry divine backing. And the clay birds, life emerging from lifeless matter, the most fundamental boundary in creation, dissolving at a prophet's breath, are the most dramatic credential available. They are included in the Quran, not despite the fact that they come from an apocryphal childhood gospel, but because they are exactly the right kind of miracle for the theological role they need to play, the sign that proves the messenger. Now look at the three words that appear twice in the Surah 3:49 passage, and once more in Surah 5:110, Bi'idni Allah, by the permission of God. Every miracle attributed to Isa in the Quran arrives wrapped in this phrase. He does not cure the blind. He cures them by the permission of God. He does not raise the dead. He raises them by the permission of God. He does not breathe life into clay birds. The birds live by the permission of God. This is not filler language. It is not liturgical decoration. It is a load-bearing doctrinal formula that the Quran places inside every miracle, story involving Jesus for a specific and deliberate reason, to ensure that no reader, anywhere, in any century, could walk away from these passages believing that Jesus performed these acts on his own divine authority. Compare it directly to the infancy gospel of Thomas. In the IGT, Jesus sees his Father's reproach, claps his hands and commands the sparrows, "Go." No permission is invoked, no mediating formula, no attribution upward to God. The birds obey him the way creation obeys its creator, because, in the IGT's theology, that is what he is. The IGT Jesus acts like God. The Quranic Isa acts like a prophet who has been granted an extraordinary gift. Same hands, same birds, same breath, entirely different chain of command. This difference is the entire theological point. The Quran is not casually repeating an old miracle story. It is surgically re-engineering one. It takes the clay birds from their original setting and rebuilds the meaning from the inside out, keeping the miracle and dismantling the metaphysics that originally surrounded it. What the Quran keeps and what it removes from the IGT version is not arbitrary. It is a precise theological edit. What it keeps, the clay, the birds, the breath, the life, the public declaration of the miracle as a sign. The listing of the clay birds alongside healing the blind, curing the leper, and raising the dead, a catalogue of miracles that establishes prophetic authority. Jesus as the one through whose hands the miracle moves, what it removes, the Sabbath setting and the accusation that triggers the miracle. The number 12. The Quran does not count the birds, the Jewish elder as antagonist, Joseph entirely. He does not appear anywhere in the Quranic account, the cursing child who dies before the birds are even made, and most critically, any framing that would allow Jesus to be read as the source of the miracle's power rather than its instrument. The Quran is not preserving the IGT by accident. It is curating it. It looked at a story the church had set aside, a story that was too much, too wild, too theologically dangerous for the canonical tradition, and found inside it exactly the miracle it needed, wrapped in exactly the wrong theology. So it kept the miracle and replaced the theology. The clay birds are magnificent. They are the kind of sign that makes an audience understand, in their bodies rather than just their minds, that the person performing it was sent from somewhere beyond ordinary human experience. The Quran needed that sign. It did not need a 5-year-old killing a neighbor child on the same morning. It did not need a Jesus who acts on his own divine authority with no reference to the God above him. Those elements were discarded. The birds were kept. 12 sparrows in the infancy gospel of Thomas, or maybe it is the Quran's version you are holding, where the birds are not counted, where they are simply birds, anonymous and plural, rising from a prophet's hands into a sky that belongs entirely to God. In one version, a small child claps and commands them, and they go because he is what he is. In the other, a messenger breathes and they go because God permitted it. The birds do not know the difference, but the two traditions that preserved this moment understood that the difference was everything. What does it mean when two religions, separated by 6 centuries and a profound theological gulf, tell the same story? Not a story with similar themes, not a story that rhymes with another story across cultures, the exact same story, same birds, same clay, same breath, the same moment of impossible life, erupting from lifeless matter in the hands of the same person. Christianity and Islam do not agree on who Jesus was. They do not agree on whether he died on a cross. They do not agree on whether he is divine or human, or some mysterious union of both. They agree on almost nothing about him except this. Once he held clay in his hands, and what he held became alive. What are we supposed to do with that? The first thing to recognize is what both texts are reaching toward. The infancy gospel of Thomas and the Quran are not, at their cores, historical documents trying to establish what literally happened in 1st century Galilee. They are theological documents trying to say something about the nature of a person who mattered so profoundly to the communities that produced them that ordinary language kept failing the attempt. What they are both trying to say, in their own vocabularies, with their own assumptions, toward their own conclusions, is that in Jesus, the line between the divine and the material world was not where everyone else assumed it was. That when God and matter met in this particular person, the results were not metaphorical, they were physical, observable, a dead thing that moves, a clay abode that flies. Both traditions felt that this image, hands shaping clay, breath releasing life, was the closest available picture of what they were trying to describe, not because one copied the other, because they were answering the same question and the same image rose to meet them. The question is, what kind of being is Jesus? It is the oldest and most contested question in the history of Western religion, and the claybird's miracle is each tradition's most compressed answer. The infancy gospel of Thomas answers without hesitation. Jesus is a being for whom the boundary between living and non-living simply does not apply. He is 5 years old and he has already demonstrated this twice in the same morning. Once to take life, once to give it. He breathes into clay, and something that was not alive is alive. He speaks in Angsaga, and something that was alive is not. The laws that govern creation do not govern him, because he is not subject to the same ontology as the rest of the world he inhabits. He wears the shape of a child. He has a father who tries to discipline him, playmates who watch him, a village that fears him. But he does not share the child's limitations or the human's subordination to natural law. The IGT does not try to explain this. It just shows it in scene after scene, with a matter-of-factness that is somehow more unsettling than any amount of theological argument. This is what he is. You are watching it happen. Make of it what you will. The Quran answers differently, with equal conviction. Jesus is a human being, fully human, bounded by human nature, subject to God's authority, the way every prophet is subject to God's authority. But he is a human being through whom God chose to work, in ways that had never been done before, and would never be done again. When Isa breathes into clay, it is not his breath that contains the power. It is God's permission flowing through his breath. The birds live not because Jesus made them live, but because God permitted them to live through the instrument of this particular man's hands. And lungs and intention. The miracle is real. The power behind it belongs entirely to God. Isa is the channel, not the source. Same act. Opposite metaphysics. And here is the thing that should stop any reader who is paying attention. Neither account is internally inconsistent. Within the framework of the IGT, the image of a 5-year-old exercising unconstrained divine power is the logical expression of what the text understands Jesus to be: God incarnate, undiminished, present in human form without being reduced by it. Within the framework of the Quran, the image of a prophet performing miracles by divine permission is the logical expression of what the text understands Jesus to be. The greatest, the messengers before Muhammad, honored above all other human beings, and yet human, and yet a servant of God rather than God himself. The miracle is the same. The theology behind it is irreconcilable. Both traditions can look at the clay birds and say in complete honesty, yes, that is exactly what we meant. This is what makes the parallel extraordinary, beyond the mere fact of textual transmission. It is not simply a case of one tradition borrowing a story from another, though the borrowing happened, and the path it traveled was real. It is a case of two traditions finding in the same story the confirmation of their own deepest commitments. Each one reading the clay birds and seeing reflected back not the other tradition's Jesus, but their own. The IGT reader sees a child who is God, playing at creation because creation is his nature and his right. The Quranic reader sees a prophet chosen by God, performing miracles that are God's gift and God's alone, the same mirror. Two entirely different faces looking into it. Neither face is wrong about what it sees. This is also what forbidden texts are actually for. Not for scholars. Not for documentary films or academic conferences or the shelves of seminary libraries, though they belong in all those places. Forbidden Gospels, the texts that official religion declined to canonize, the stories that were excluded by omission or condemned by council or simply allowed to fade, are the record of what religion feels like from the inside before it has been organized into doctrine. Official canons tell us what institutions decided to preserve. The Apocrypha tell us what people could not stop carrying. The clay bird story was not preserved because a bishop decided it was theologically sound. It was preserved because people loved it. Because there is something in it, a small child, wet clay, the impossible moment when a sparrow that was not alive a moment ago spreads wings it did not have a moment ago and rises. That human beings across languages and centuries and theological revolutions have recognized as true at a level below argument. The Quran recognized it. The Arabic-speaking Christians of the 6th century recognized it. The Syriac missionaries recognized it. The Egyptian monks who copied the earliest Greek manuscripts recognized it. Every community that touched this story and passed it on was saying the same thing without using the same words. This image. This is the one that gets closest. Come back to where we started. A 5-year-old boy at a stream on the holiest morning of the week, his hands covered in wet clay. Around him the Sabbath is silent and watching. He has the shape of a bird between his palms. He closes his hands. He breathes. He opens his hands. Something that was not alive is alive. Call it the divine nature expressing itself through an incarnate God who cannot be contained even at age 5. Call it prophetic gift, the breath of a chosen messenger carrying God's permission down into matter. Call it bi-idni Allah, by the permission of God, Or call it what the IGT implies by saying nothing at all, that he did it because he could, because he always could, because that is what he is. The birds do not know what to call it. They are already gone, already small against the morning sky, already beyond the reach of the accusation that was about to fall and the theology that would spend the next 2,000 years trying to explain what just happened at the bank of that stream. 2 holy books, 1 story, both of them pointing at the same small hands and saying, "Whatever happened there,